I wasn't looking for this. I want to be clear about that from the beginning because what I'm about to describe sounds like something a person goes searching for when they've already made up their mind. But that's not what happened. I was researching mortar composition. That's it. I had become interested in why certain 19th-century buildings in the American Midwest seemed to be holding up better than structures built 50 or 60 years later with supposedly superior materials. I wanted to understand the Thayet recipes, Thayet ratios, Thayet chemistry. I figured I'd find some interesting footnotes about regional light variations and move on with my life. Then I found the photographs. Not photographs of buildings, photographs of buildings being covered. Work crews in the 1910s and 1920s applying layers of white plaster, concrete render, and white stucco over original facades. At first, I assumed this was routine preservation work. Old buildings get weathered. Surfaces need protection. It made sense. But the more images I collected, the more I noticed something that didn't fit the preservation explanation at all. They weren't covering damaged sections. They were covering the most intricate sections. The parts with the most detail. The parts where the stonework curved in ways that looked almost biological. And they were doing it systematically, across multiple cities, within a remarkably compressed timeline. I told myself there had to be a simple answer. Architectural fashion changes. Maybe ornate Victorian facades fell out of style, and cities wanted cleaner lines. Maybe the covering was cheaper than restoration. Maybe I was seeing a pattern where there was only coincidence. So I started checking details. I pulled close-ups of the original surfaces visible in photographs taken before the covering campaigns. I compared them against known masonry techniques of the era. And that's when the first crack appeared in the easy explanation. The curves weren't carved. Not in any conventional sense. When you carve stone, you leave tool marks. Even the finest craftsman working with the best chisels leaves microscopic evidence of removal. The stone resists. It chips. It fractures along grain lines. But in these photographs, magnified as far as the image quality would allow, I couldn't find the marks. The surfaces looked continuous, smooth in a way that suggested formation rather than subtraction. Like the material had been shaped while soft and then hardened in place. I told myself it was just the photograph quality. Old images lose detail. Grain obscures fine marks. I was reading too much into blurry silver halide. But then I found the same patterns in photographs from different archives. Different cities, different photographers, different decades, all showing the same impossible smoothness on architectural details that should have borne the scars of their making. Not carvings, not castings. Something else. The institutional response to these images is what pushed me further. I started reaching out to architectural historians, preservation specialists, anyone who might have studied these facades before and after the covering. The responses followed a pattern I would see again and again. Acknowledge, categorize, move on. Yes, the covering campaigns happened. Yes, they were extensive. Yes, the original surfaces displayed unusual characteristics. But the explanation was always the same. Skilled artisans using techniques that have been lost. Regional variations in stone composition. Experimental mortar formulas that created unusual surface textures. Nothing unexplained. Nothing requiring deeper investigation. I don't think anyone was lying to me. I don't think there was a coordinated effort to suppress information. What I think happened is simpler, and in some ways, more troubling. The questions I was asking didn't fit into existing categories. They fell between academic disciplines. Architectural history focuses on design, intent, and cultural context. Material science focuses on chemical composition. Preservation focuses on conservation technique. Nobody's job description includes explaining why 19th-century stone facades look grown rather than built. So the anomalies got filed under decorative technique, or regional style, and everyone moved on to questions that had clearer answers. I couldn't move on. Not after I started measuring. There's a building in a Midwestern city I won't name specifically because I don't want to draw unwanted attention to it, or the people who work there. It's a former civic structure, built in the 1870s according to official records, now used for commercial purposes. Part of the original facade remains exposed on a side elevation that faces an alley. The rest was covered in the 1920s with a thick layer of concrete render that's now cracking and falling away in places. I spent 3 days in that alley with measuring tape, calipers, a camera, and a strong flashlight. What I found doesn't prove anything, but it doesn't fit the official narrative either. The exposed section shows a series of decorative columns with capitals that feature elaborate, organic motifs. Leaves, vines, flowers, all rendered in stone with curves that flow continuously without visible joints or seams. The columns themselves taper in a ratio that matches no standard classical order. Not Doric, not Ionic, not Corinthian, not any of the hybrid variations documented in 19th-century pattern books. The taper follows a logarithmic spiral, the same mathematical curve you find in nautilus shells, in sunflower seed arrangements, in the growth patterns of biological structures optimizing for strength and material efficiency. I measured the spiral at 17 points along one column. The consistency was within 2 millimeters across the entire height. No human hand holding a chisel maintains that precision over 3 meters of vertical stone. Not without constant measurement and correction. Not without visible adjustment marks where the craftsmen checked their work and compensated for drift. There were no adjustment marks. The curve was continuous, organic, like it had grown that way. Maybe there's a technique I don't know about. Maybe 19th-century masons had methods for achieving biological precision in carved stone that have genuinely been lost. I can't rule that out. But I can say that no one I've asked has been able to explain specifically how it would have been done. The explanations stay vague. Skilled craftsmen, master artisans, techniques passed down through guilds. But no one describes the actual process. No one points to documentary evidence of how a human being with hand tools achieved what I was measuring in that alley. And then, there's the question of time. According to construction records, this building went up in 14 months. A 4-story civic structure with elaborate facades on 3 sides. Interior, detailing that included carved stone staircases and decorative ceiling medallions, and a basement level with vaulted ceilings. 14 months. In an era before power tools. Before electric lighting that would allow night shifts. Before modern scaffolding systems. Before pneumatic lifts. I've talked to contemporary stonemasons. People who work on restoration projects with power tools and hydraulic equipment. They estimate that the decorative elements alone on the exposed facade section would take a team of 4 skilled carvers between 8 and 12 months working full-time. Just the section I could see from the alley. Not the whole building. Not the interior. Not the structural work. Just the ornamental stone carving on one partial facade. The math doesn't add up. Either the records are wrong, or the techniques were different from what we assume, or something else was happening. I started looking for contemporary accounts of the construction, newspaper articles, personal diaries, city council minutes, building inspector reports. What I found was thin, fragmentary, and strangely incurious. The local newspaper mentioned the groundbreaking ceremony. It mentioned the dedication ceremony 14 months later. In between, almost nothing. No articles about the remarkable speed of construction. No profiles of the master craftsmen achieving architectural miracles. No letters to the editor marveling at the growing structure. Just a brief mention that construction was proceeding on schedule, and a single photograph showing the building at roughly the halfway point with scaffolding obscuring most of the details. Maybe that's normal. Maybe 19th-century newspapers didn't cover construction projects in detail. But when I looked at coverage of other major buildings from the same era in the same region, I found the opposite. Long features about construction techniques, named architects and foremen, progress photographs published at regular intervals, public fascination with the mechanical achievement of raising large structures. For this building, silence. As if no one thought the process was worth documenting, or as if someone had decided it shouldn't be documented. I'm not claiming a cover-up. I want to be careful here. Historical records are incomplete for all kinds of mundane reasons. Newspapers change editors. Archives get damaged. Some events just don't get covered. But the pattern of what's missing felt intentional in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The building appears suddenly in the historical record, fully formed, and nobody seems to have witnessed its becoming. That's when I started looking at maps. Cartographic records tell their own stories, not just about geography, but about what a society considers important enough to name, categorize, and track. I started comparing maps of American cities from the 1850s through the 1920s, looking for patterns in how buildings like the one in that Midwestern alley were classified and described. What I found was a terminology shift that happened gradually but consistently across multiple mapping agencies and municipal record systems. In maps and surveys from the 1850s and 1860s, certain structures were classified using language that has since disappeared from architectural vocabulary. Terms like growth stone construction and formed masonry appear in surveyor notes and property assessments. The language suggests a distinction between buildings that were assembled from pre-cut blocks and buildings that were made through some other process. A process that the surveyors of the time considered normal enough to have its own terminology, but unusual enough to be worth noting. By the 1880s, those terms start to disappear. Property records begin using generic classifications. Stone construction, masonry building. The specificity fades. And by the 1910s, when the covering campaigns were in full swing, the older terminology is gone entirely. Not contradicted, not explained, just absent. As if the category it described had been erased from institutional memory. I found one surveyor's notebook from 1863 in a university archive. The handwriting is cramped and the ink is faded, but certain passages are legible. The surveyor is describing a commercial building in a river city. He notes the construction type as crystalline growth, west wall showing formation lines. He records the building's age as indeterminate, predating settlement records. And he makes a marginal note that the owner claims the structure grew from foundation stones placed by previous occupants unknown. That's the entire entry. No elaboration, no skepticism, no indication that the surveyor found this description unusual or unbelievable. He recorded it the same way he recorded lot dimensions and tax assessments, as a mundane fact of the built environment. I spent weeks trying to find other references to crystalline growth construction. The term appears in a handful of scattered documents from the same era. A building inspector's report from 1859, a property deed from 1867, a fire insurance assessment from 1871. Always mentioned casually, never explained, and completely absent from any document I could find after 1885. It was ordinary to them. It's strange to us. That gap is what I can't stop thinking about. The physical discoveries reported in mainstream newspapers of the 19th century follow a parallel pattern. Brief mentions of unusual findings during construction or demolition projects. Structures revealed beneath structures. Materials that didn't match known geological deposits. Artifacts that suggested previous occupation by builders working at scales and with techniques unknown to contemporary engineers. And then silence. I found 7 newspaper articles from the 1870s describing what workers found during excavation projects in major American cities. Foundation walls extending far deeper than expected. Stone channels of unknown purpose running beneath street level. Chambers with ceilings too high and doorways too wide for normal human use. Each article treats the discovery as a curiosity, something worth a few column inches. And then, no follow-up, no investigation, no attempt to document or preserve what was found. In 3 of the 7 cases, I was able to trace what happened to the discovered structures. They were demolished, filled in, built over. The sites now hold unremarkable buildings with no historical markers, indicating what lies beneath. Maybe the discoveries weren't significant. Maybe 19th-century newspapermen exaggerated minor findings for entertainment value. Maybe the demolitions were practical responses to construction delays. I can't prove otherwise. But the pattern troubles me. Find something strange, note it briefly, destroy it, move on, repeat. It's not the behavior of a society that wants to understand its past. It's the behavior of a society that's decided its past contains something it doesn't want to examine too closely. The artifacts are what finally pushed me from curiosity into something closer to obsession. I started visiting antique markets, estate sales, architectural salvage yards, looking for physical remnants of the buildings that were covered or demolished. Door handles, window hardware, decorative brackets, stair railings, the functional pieces that get stripped out during renovation and scattered into the secondary market. What I found defied the categories I'd been taught to use. A door handle from a building demolished in 1922. The dealer had it labeled as ornamental Victorian cast iron, but the proportions were wrong. The grip span measured 11.5 centimeters. Normal door handles range from 9 to 10 centimeters. The extra width means nothing for decoration, but it means everything for function. This handle was designed for a hand larger than average human range. I could dismiss one oversized handle as manufacturing variation, but I found 17 more over the following months. Different dealers, different cities, different buildings of origin where provenance could be established, all with the same proportional excess, all labeled as decorative, none acknowledged as functionally unusual. The stair components told a similar story. I found salvaged balusters from an 1870s institutional building being sold at an estate sale. The spacing between them measured 16 centimeters. Standard building codes call for 10 centimeters maximum to prevent children from slipping through. 16 centimeters is dangerous by modern standards. But the original building served as a school. If these balusters were original to that construction, then either 19th century builders had no concern for child safety in a building explicitly designed for children, or the building was originally intended for occupants whose proportions made 16 centimeter spacing appropriate. The wear patterns were what convinced me these weren't decorative reproductions or later additions. The undersides of the balusters showed decades of accumulated grime in patterns consistent with hands gripping them while ascending and descending stairs. Real hands. Many hands. Over many years. Hands that fit the proportions. I measured a salvage door from an 1860s commercial building. The door itself stands 243 centimeters tall. Standard interior doors are 203 centimeters. The extra 40 centimeters serves no decorative purpose. Doors are functional objects. Their height is determined by the clearance needs of the people passing through them. This door was designed for people who needed 40 centimeters more headroom than modern humans require. Or something else. Something that used these spaces before the humans who wrote the records we consider authoritative. What if the buildings weren't constructed at all? What if they were grown? I need to be careful how I frame this because it sounds like exactly the kind of leap that discredits legitimate inquiry. But stay with me for a moment and consider it as a hypothesis, a lens for re-examining the evidence rather than a conclusion. Coral reefs grow. They start from small colonies and expand through biological processes that deposit calcium carbonate in complex, mathematically precise structures. No blueprint, no construction crew, just encoded information expressed through material accumulation over time. Trees grow. They expand from seed points, following programmed patterns that produce functional structures capable of bearing enormous loads and resisting tremendous forces. The growth is responsive, adaptive. It optimizes for conditions in ways that human engineering still struggles to replicate. Crystals grow. They form from solution or melt according to atomic-level instructions that produce identical geometric patterns at every scale. The Egyptians knew about crystalline growth. The Chinese knew about it. Every ancient civilization that worked with minerals understood that stone could be formed, not just carved. What if the buildings that looked grown in those old photographs actually were grown? What if the previous civilization possessed techniques for programming stone, the way coral programs calcium carbonate or trees program cellulose? What if the impossible curves and biological precision I measured in that alley were exactly what they appeared to be? Organic formation rather than mechanical construction. This would explain the construction timelines. You don't need armies of carvers working around the clock if the stone is forming itself according to embedded instructions. You need a foundation, a seed structure, the right conditions, and time. This would explain the continuous surfaces without tool marks. There are no tool marks because there were no tools. The material flowed into its final form the way lava flows into geological formations, the way ice flows into crystals, the way bone flows into skeleton. This would explain why the techniques can't be replicated. We've been trying to carve what was meant to be grown. We've been trying to assemble what was meant to form. We've been looking for construction methods when we should have been looking for cultivation methods. And this would explain the covering campaigns. If you discovered that the built environment you inherited was not built at all, but grown through processes you don't understand and can't replicate, you would face an uncomfortable choice. You could admit that your predecessors possessed capabilities that dwarf your own, that your civilization represents a step backward, not forward, that the foundation of your cities was laid by hands you cannot identify, using techniques you cannot explain. Or you could cover it up, literally, layer by layer, concrete over crystal, plaster over growth stone, stucco over the evidence of your own ignorance. I'm not claiming this is what happened. I'm saying it explains more than the official narrative. And I'm saying the official narrative has holes that nobody seems interested in filling. But there are counter-explanations. I have to acknowledge them because intellectual honesty demands it, and because dismissing them would make me exactly the kind of person I criticize, someone who starts with a conclusion and bends evidence to fit. Counter-explanation 1. The photographs are misleading. Old photographic processes produce artifacts. Surfaces appear smoother than they were. Details get lost in the grain. What I'm interpreting as biological formation might be nothing more than the limitations of 19th-century imaging technology. This is a serious objection. It's possible that high-resolution photographs of the same structures would show perfectly normal tool marks that the old images couldn't capture. I can't fully dismiss this, but I can say that the covering campaign specifically targeted the structures that looked most unusual in the photographs. If the unusual appearance was just a photographic artifact, why would renovation crews focus on covering exactly those surfaces? Why not cover everything equally? The selective nature of the covering suggests that something about those specific surfaces was considered worth hiding. Photographic artifacts don't explain that selectivity. Counter-explanation 2. Lost techniques. Human beings have invented and forgotten more technologies than we've retained. Roman concrete outperforms modern concrete in marine environments because the formula was lost for centuries. Damascus steel possessed properties that modern metallurgy still can't replicate. It's entirely possible that 19th-century masons possessed techniques for achieving organic-looking stonework that genuinely have been lost. No mystery, no previous civilization, just the normal pattern of knowledge degradation over time. This explanation covers more of the evidence than the photographic artifact theory. But it still has problems. Lost techniques leave traces. They appear in apprenticeship records, in guild documents, in pattern books and trade publications. Somewhere, someone writes down how the amazing process works, even if later generations fail to understand or replicate it. I've looked for those records extensively. What I find is the same vague language: skilled artisans, master craftsmen, traditional techniques, but no actual descriptions, no step-by-step processes, no explanations of how human hands and human tools produce those continuous curves and biological spirals. The absence of documentation is the problem, not the presence of mystery. If these were simply lost techniques, they would have been documented when they were still in use. The fact that they weren't suggests either that the techniques were deliberately kept secret, or that the buildings weren't made through techniques at all. Counter-explanation 3. I'm seeing patterns that don't exist. The human mind is a pattern recognition machine. It finds connections where there are none. It weaves narratives from coincidence. What I'm experiencing might be nothing more than confirmation bias on an elaborate scale. I found a few anomalous photographs and measurements and constructed an entire alternative history to explain them, when the true explanation is simpler: random variation, incomplete records, and my own need to find meaning in chaos. This is the objection I take most seriously, because I know it could be true. I know that I've spent months going down this path, and that intellectual investment creates its own momentum. I want the hypothesis to be right because I've staked something on it, but I keep coming back to the measurements. 11.5 centimeter door handles, 16 centimeter baluster, spacing, 243 centimeter door heights, logarithmic spirals consistent to 2 millimeters across 3 meters. These aren't patterns I'm imagining. These are numbers, recorded, repeatable, verifiable by anyone willing to find the same artifacts and measure them the same way. The numbers don't tell me what the explanation is, but they tell me that the official explanation is incomplete. That's not confirmation bias. That's evidence. So where does this leave me? Uncertain, unsettled, unable to stop. I don't know if buildings can be grown. I don't know if a previous civilization possessed bioarchitectural technology that we've lost. I don't know if the covering campaigns of the early 20th century were deliberate suppression or just changing aesthetic preferences. I can't prove any of it. What I can say is that the pattern holds together better than it should if there were nothing to it. The photographs, the measurements, the terminology shifts, the newspaper, silences, the functional artifacts, labeled decorative, the organic geometry, hidden beneath layers of modern material. Something doesn't fit, and the institutions that should be investigating the gaps are instead categorizing them away, filing them under decorative and lost techniques and skilled craftsmen, and moving on. Maybe that's all they can do. Maybe the questions I'm asking fall so far outside accepted frameworks that no academic department knows how to process them. Maybe I'm not facing a conspiracy of suppression, but a conspiracy of incomprehension, a collective inability to see what's right in front of us, because seeing it would require abandoning too many foundational assumptions. But here's what I keep circling back to. Here's the thing I can't let go of. The surveyors in the 1860s had words for it: growth stone construction, crystalline formation. They wrote these terms in their notebooks without commentary or confusion. To them, grown buildings were a category, not a mystery, not a controversy, just a type of structure among other types of structures. Somewhere between their time and ours, the category disappeared. Not because we learned that grown buildings don't exist, but because we stopped believing they could exist. We edited our assumptions, and our assumptions edited our vocabulary, and our vocabulary edited our perception. And then we covered the evidence with concrete. I started this research looking for mortar recipes, I thought I'd find some interesting historical footnotes and move on. Instead, I found a seam. A place where the story we tell ourselves about our built environment pulls away from the physical reality we inherited. What else is hidden under those layers? What other technologies? What other capabilities? What other possibilities have been plastered over and forgotten? I don't have answers. I have a direction, and I have questions that won't let me rest. Why did those surveyors have vocabulary for something we consider impossible? Why do the timelines never add up? Why do the proportions consistently exceed human ergonomic range? And why, in photograph after photograph, do work crews from a century ago appear to be covering exactly the features that look least like anything human hands could have made? The investigation continues, because the buildings are still there, beneath the concrete, still holding their secrets, still waiting for someone willing to scrape away the layers and see what grows beneath. The more I looked, the more I found. And the more I found, the less the conventional explanations satisfied. I want to walk you through what happened when I started examining the covering campaigns themselves. Not just the fact that they happened, but the how. The sequence, the materials, the timing. Because the details reveal something that the general narrative obscures. The first thing I noticed was the speed. Between 1905 and 1929, major cities across North America and Europe undertook extensive facade renovation programs that official histories attribute to modernization, fire safety improvements, and urban beautification. The scope was enormous, thousands of buildings, millions of square meters of original surface covered, altered, or removed. I pulled municipal records from 6 cities, construction permits, materials invoices, work crew manifests. What I found was a timeline that compressed impossibly. In one city, 312 buildings received facade treatments in a single 18-month period. The work included removing original ornamental elements, applying base coats of a tight cement render, adding secondary layers of smoothing compound, and finishing with painted stucco or modern cladding. Each building required scaffolding installation, surface preparation, multiple application phases with curing time between layers, and final inspection. I talked to a modern facade restoration specialist, someone who does this work today with power tools, hydraulic lifts, and synthetic materials designed to cure faster than traditional compounds. He estimated that each building in the historical record would require a minimum of 3 weeks of active work time, assuming no weather delays and no complications from the original surface condition. 312 buildings. 3 weeks minimum per building. That's 936 weeks of work. 18 years if done sequentially by a single crew. But the records show it completed in 18 months. The only way the math works is if multiple crews were working simultaneously across the entire city. Dozens of crews, maybe hundreds. All trained, all equipped, all applying the same techniques to the same specifications at the same time. That requires coordination, planning, resources. It requires someone deciding that this work needed to happen fast and mobilizing the infrastructure to make it happen. Why the rush? Urban beautification doesn't require emergency timelines. Fire safety improvements can be phased over years. Modernization proceeds building by building as owners choose to renovate. None of the official explanations account for the compressed timeline. None of them explain why cities would marshal construction resources on a scale normally reserved for wartime mobilization just to change the appearance of existing buildings. Unless appearance wasn't the point. Unless something about the original surfaces needed to be hidden quickly, before too many people looked too closely, before documentation technologies improved, before questions accumulated that couldn't be easily answered. I found a photograph from 1911 showing a work crew on scaffolding outside what the caption identifies as a former government building. The image quality is good enough to see details. The workers are applying a thick gray compound to a wall section where the original stone is still partially visible. The original stone shows the same organic curvature I'd seen in other photographs, the same continuous surfaces, the same impossible geometry. But there's something else in this photograph that stopped me. One of the workers is holding a tool I don't recognize. It's not a trowel, not a float, not any standard plastering implement I could identify in historical tool catalogs. The shape is wrong. The proportions are wrong. It looks almost like a probe or a sensor rather than an application tool. And the worker isn't using it to spread material. He's pressing it against the original stone surface in what looks like a measurement or testing gesture. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it's a specialized tool for checking surface adhesion that simply fell out of common use. Maybe the photograph angle is distorting something ordinary into something strange. But I found 3 more photographs from different cities showing similar scenes. Work crews on scaffolding, original organic stonework being covered, and in each image, at least one worker holding or using a tool that doesn't appear in any historical masonry equipment catalog I could locate. What were they testing? What were they measuring? And why would covering campaigns require instrumentation that applying plaster normally wouldn't need? The material composition is another anomaly. I obtained samples from 3 buildings where the original covering layer is now deteriorating, and fragments can be collected without damaging the structures. A materials engineer analyzed the samples at my request. What he found didn't match the construction records. The covering compound contains calciumite silicate and Portland cement, which is expected. But it also contains unusual aditite additives, metallic particles, trace minerals that don't appear in standard construction materials of the era. And in one sample, a crystalline structure embedded in the matrix that the engineer couldn't identify without more sophisticated analysis. He asked me where the samples came from. When I told him, he went quiet for a moment. Then he said something I've thought about every day since. This isn't preservation material. This is shielding. I asked him what he meant. He said the composition reminded him of materials used to block electromagnetic radiation. The metallic particles, the mineral traces, the crystalline inclusions. They're not structural. They don't improve adhesion or durability, but they would interfere with certain types of signal transmission or energy transfer. Shielding against what? He didn't know. He said it might be coincidental. The additives might have served some mundane purpose that made sense in the context of early 20th century construction chemistry. He couldn't prove the shielding interpretation without more samples and more sophisticated analysis. But the question lodged in my mind. What if the covering campaigns weren't just hiding the appearance of the original buildings? What if they were blocking something the buildings were doing? I know how that sounds. I know it edges toward the kind of speculation that makes serious researchers dismiss an entire line of inquiry. But stay with the evidence for a moment longer. If the buildings were grown rather than built, they might retain some connection to the processes that formed them. Crystals resonate. Living systems emit electromagnetic signatures. Biological structures interact with their environments in ways that dead materials don't. A grown building might not be fully inert. It might still be doing something, emitting something, responding to something. And if you wanted to stop that, you'd need more than paint. You'd need material that could interrupt whatever was happening at the surface. Material that could isolate the structure from its environment. Material that could, in the engineer's word, shield it. I can't prove this interpretation, but it explains the unusual composition better than any alternative I've considered. And it explains why the covering needed to happen fast, before whatever the buildings were doing attracted too much attention. The record-keeping around this period shows its own peculiarities. I spent 2 weeks in a regional archive examining building inspection reports from 1908 through 1924. What I was looking for was documentation of the original facades, condition assessments, structural evaluations. The kind of records that should exist for any major municipal building before renovation work begins. What I found instead was absence structured to look like presence. The files exist. The folders are labeled. The index cards are filled out. But inside, the actual documentation is sparse, fragmentary, often limited to a single page, noting that an inspection occurred and that facade renovation was recommended. No photographs, no detailed descriptions, no measurements, no notes about what specifically required treatment or why. Compare this to inspection files from the same archive covering the same period for buildings that weren't part of the covering campaigns. Those files are thick, detailed. They include photographs, diagrams, material assessments, structural calculations. The inspectors of that era were thorough. They documented everything, except the buildings that were about to be covered. For those, the files contain almost nothing. It could be coincidence. Records get lost. Files get misfiled. Some buildings generate more documentation than others for bureaucratic reasons that have nothing to do with concealment. But the pattern held across every category I checked. Buildings that retain their original facades have thick files. Buildings that were covered have thin files. The correlation was nearly perfect. Someone made a decision about what to document and what to leave undocumented. And that decision aligned precisely with which buildings would be hidden and which would remain visible. The personal accounts are the hardest evidence to evaluate because they come filtered through decades of retelling and the natural tendency of memory to reshape itself around narrative expectations. But I found 3 separate accounts from people whose grandparents or great-grandparents worked on covering crews in the 1910s and 1920s. The accounts were recorded at different times, in different contexts, by interviewers who had no connection to each other, and they share details that don't appear in any official documentation I've found. The first account describes a great-grandfather who worked on a covering crew in an eastern city. According to family memory, he told his children that the foreman gave strict instructions never to chip or damage the original stone, not for preservation reasons, because he claimed the stone would respond if damaged. He never explained what that meant, but he reportedly refused to discuss the work in detail for the rest of his life, and he had nightmares about it until he died. The second account describes a grandmother who prepared meals for a covering crew working on buildings in a Midwestern city. She claimed the workers talked among themselves about surfaces that were warm to the touch even in winter, about stone that seemed to change color depending on who was touching it, about sounds that came from inside the walls when work stopped for the day. The workers, according to this account, believed they were sealing something in, not just covering something up. The third account is the most detailed and the most troubling. A great-great-grandfather who worked as a site supervisor for a covering project in a major metropolitan area. According to family letters preserved by his descendants, he wrote home describing original surfaces that appeared to be growing back overnight. Plaster applied in the afternoon would crack and separate by morning, pushed outward from beneath. The crews had to apply thicker layers than specified. They had to use heavier materials. They had to work faster because the buildings, in his words, didn't want to be closed. I can't verify these accounts. I can't prove the family memories are accurate or that the original statements were made as described. Oral history is unreliable. Details get embellished. Stories grow in the telling, but the consistency troubles me. 3 unconnected accounts, 3 different cities, 3 different crews, and all 3 describing buildings that seem to resist being covered. Buildings that seem to be alive. What if they were? I want to go back to the hypothesis I proposed earlier and stress test it against everything I've found since. If the previous civilization possessed bioarchitecture technology capable of growing buildings from programmed stone or crystal matrices, we would expect to see several things. We would expect construction timelines that don't match the labor requirements of conventional building. We see that. We would expect surfaces that show organic formation patterns, rather than tool marks. We see that. We would expect proportions optimized for non-human or larger than human occupants. We see that. We would expect terminology in older records that acknowledges grown structures as a category. We see that. We would expect a systematic effort to hide or obscure the evidence once the technology was lost or suppressed. We see that. We would expect the covering materials to have unusual properties beyond simple cosmetic concealment. We see that. We would expect institutional reluctance to investigate the anomalies. We see that. And if the buildings retained some residual activity from their formation process, we would expect accounts of resistance to covering, accounts of unusual surface behavior, accounts of workers sensing something wrong. We see that too. The hypothesis fits the evidence better than the conventional narrative. That doesn't make it true, but it makes it worth taking seriously. It makes it worth asking why the conventional narrative has so many holes and why nobody seems interested in filling them. I've tried to find the point where the hypothesis breaks down, the piece of evidence that contradicts it so clearly that I can let it go and move on. I haven't found that yet. What I've found instead are more questions. There's a building in a southern city that survived the covering campaigns. It was slated for treatment in 1922, according to municipal records. But the work was never completed. The contractor defaulted. The funding was redirected. The building was eventually sold to a private owner who made no changes to the exterior. I visited that building last spring. I spent 4 days examining the facades with permission from the current owner, who was curious about my interest but asked no difficult questions. The original surface is intact, and it shows everything I'd seen in photographs of other buildings before they were covered, but in 3 dimensions, in person, under my hands. The stone curves in ways that stone shouldn't curve. The surfaces are continuous across joints that look like they should be seams but aren't. The proportions follow the same biological ratios I measured in salvaged artifacts. And there's something else, something I wasn't prepared for. The stone is warm, not warm like sun-heated material. The building faces north. The surfaces I touched were in permanent shadow, but they were warm, slightly, barely perceptibly, but consistently, across every surface I tested. Stone doesn't generate heat. Inert materials don't maintain temperature differentials with their environment. If the stone is warm, something is happening inside it. Some process, some activity, some residual function that the covering campaigns were designed to stop. I took thermal measurements. The original stone surfaces averaged 2.3 degrees higher than ambient air temperature. The adjacent modern materials, additions made in the 1950s, matched ambient exactly. 2.3 degrees. It's not much. It could be measurement error. It could be some property of the stone composition I don't understand. It could be residual heat from deep in the structure conducted through the material. But it could also be something else. Something that's been happening inside these buildings for longer than anyone living can remember. Something that the concrete and plaster were designed to suppress. The building that wasn't covered is still doing whatever it was designed to do. I don't know what that is. I don't know if it's beneficial or dangerous or neutral. I don't know if the covering campaigns were protection or suppression or simply ignorance responding to what it couldn't understand. But I know the anomaly is real. I measured it. I documented it. Anyone who visits that building with appropriate instruments can verify it for themselves. What else is happening beneath the layers? We've applied to our inheritance. What other processes are we interrupting? What other functions are we suppressing? What else did we bury because we couldn't explain it? I keep coming back to a single image. Those work crews on their scaffolding, applying layer after layer to surfaces that showed evidence of growth rather than construction. using tools that don't appear in any catalog, working at speeds that suggest urgency rather than routine, covering something they may not have fully understood because their supervisors told them it needed to be hidden. And beneath them, under the fresh plaster and the gray cement, the building's waiting, patient, still warm, still doing whatever they were grown to do. I want to tell you I've found answers. I want to tell you I've cracked the code and can explain exactly what happened, who did it, and why. That's what these investigations are supposed to deliver. Resolution, clarity, the satisfaction of mystery solved. I can't give you that. What I can give you is a pattern. A consistent, repeated pattern that appears across photographs and measurements and records and accounts and materials, analysis and thermal readings. A pattern that the official narrative doesn't explain and doesn't try to explain, because explaining it would require admitting that the foundations of our built environment are stranger than we want to believe. Here's what I think happened. I'm offering this not as proven fact, but as the hypothesis that best fits what I've found. A previous civilization possessed technology for growing buildings from programmed materials. We don't know what they called themselves. We don't know how long they existed. We don't know what happened to them. But they left their structures behind, and those structures were still standing when the civilization we consider our own began keeping records. Early settlers encountered these buildings and used them. They didn't understand how they were made, but they understood they were useful. Surveyors noted the unusual construction type using terminology that has since disappeared. Newspapers occasionally mentioned discoveries that didn't fit standard explanations, but moved on quickly because the discoveries raised questions no one was prepared to answer. Then something changed. In the late 19th or early 20th century, someone decided the original buildings needed to be hidden. Maybe they understood too much about what the buildings were doing. Maybe they understood too little and feared what they couldn't explain. Maybe the decision came from above, from people or institutions whose names we don't know, for reasons we can only speculate about. The covering campaigns began, fast, systematic, using materials designed not just to hide but to block. The terminology was suppressed. The documentation was thinned. The workers were told not to ask questions. And within a generation, the category disappeared. Grown buildings became carved buildings in the public. Memory. Biological precision became skilled craftsmanship. Organic formation became decorative artistry. The truth was plastered over, and the questions were filed away. Now, we walk through cities built on foundations we didn't lay, using streets planned by people whose names we've forgotten, past buildings whose original surfaces we've never seen. We think we understand our environment because we've labeled it, categorized it, assigned it dates, and architects and construction methods that fit our expectations. But the buildings are still there, beneath the concrete, beneath the plaster, beneath the layers of assumption and forgetting, still warm, still waiting. I don't know what we're supposed to do with this information. I don't know if the covering was necessary or harmful. I don't know if uncovering the original surfaces would reveal something wonderful or something dangerous. I don't know if the building should remain sealed or if the ceiling is the problem. What I know is that we've been told a story about our built environment that doesn't match the physical evidence. We've been given a history that has gaps where the most interesting parts should be. We've been asked to accept explanations that explain less than they obscure. And most of us have accepted, because accepting is easier than questioning. Because the questions lead to places where the familiar categories stop working. Because once you start measuring the inconsistencies, once you start comparing the photographs, once you start listening to the accounts that don't fit the official narrative, you can't go back to comfortable certainty. I can't go back. I've seen too much, measured too much, read too many fragmentary records and examined too many salvaged artifacts, and touched too many warm stones that should be cold. Something grew here before we arrived. Something we've spent a century trying to hide. And the hiding itself tells us more than any official explanation ever could. Why cover what you can explain? Why rush to conceal what poses no threat? Why use shielding materials if there's nothing to shield against? Why strip documentation if there's nothing unusual to document? The covering campaigns were urgent, systematic, resource-intensive. Whatever those workers were sealing away was important enough to mobilize cities, important enough to coordinate across continents, important enough to suppress for generations. We're still living with the results, walking past buildings whose true nature lies hidden beneath decades of accumulated concealment. Accepting the story we've been told, because questioning it requires effort and leads to uncertainty. But the buildings are patient. Stone is patient. Whatever grows in stone is patient. The concrete cracks, the plaster crumbles, the coverings fail, and beneath them, slowly, the original surfaces are beginning to show through. I've documented 17 locations where deteriorating modern layers are revealing glimpses of original facades. 17 places where anyone with curiosity and a camera can see for themselves what's been hidden. 17 opportunities to verify that the photographs weren't lying, that the measurements weren't wrong, that the hypothesis isn't fantasy. The investigation doesn't end here. It can't end here. Because the questions are bigger than one person's inquiry, bigger than one video's runtime, bigger than any single piece of evidence or any single building or any single city. What did we inherit? Who built it? How did they build it? Why did we cover it? What were we afraid of? What should we be afraid of? And the question I can't stop asking, the one that wakes me at 3 in the morning and won't let me rest. What happens when the covering finally fails? The buildings are still there. The warmth is still there. The patterns of growth encoded in stone over timescales we can only guess at are still there. We sealed them, but we didn't understand them, and something that operates on geological timescales doesn't measure setbacks the way we do. A century of concrete is nothing to a structure that was growing before anyone we know how to name was born. The coverings are failing, across thousands of buildings in hundreds of cities in dozens of countries. Cracking, crumbling, revealing glimpses of what we spent so much effort trying to hide. Maybe that's natural deterioration. Maybe that's poor maintenance. Maybe that's just entropy doing what entropy does. Or maybe the buildings are pushing back, slowly, patiently. The way growing things always push back against what tries to contain them. Roots crack concrete. Vines pull down walls. Trees split stone. Living things don't stay buried. They find their way to the surface. They reach for the light. They resume what they were interrupted doing. What were those buildings doing before we covered them? What will they do when the covering is gone? I don't have answers, but I know where to look for them, in the alleys where original facades remain exposed. In the archives where fragmented records preserve traces of erased terminology. In the salvage yards where oversized artifacts wait for someone to measure their proportions. In the buildings where the modern layers are failing and the original surfaces are beginning to emerge. The evidence is there. The questions are there. The investigation continues. And somewhere beneath the concrete, patient and warm, the buildings are waiting. They've been waiting for a very long time. I don't think they'll wait much longer.